everybody, welcome to Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I think Nick's are the questions. Yeah, Nick's fine, Ranger's fine. So, I'm glad you stopped because I like to tell this story, and I think it's a really interesting story. You may not be able to see it from where we're standing right here, but actually this spot was a spot that rivaled the production of Cleveland. The industrial production, the amount of manufacturing, and the things that were produced, it rivaled that at one point. And to look around right now, you may not see it as a big industrial center. Now, this was a long time ago. This is not rivaling Cleveland today, but this is back in the 1830s. It raises a lot of questions, you know, why this looks like it does now and why Cleveland is the city that it has become. And I like this story for a couple of reasons. One, it's not a story that like leaves you with this big moral to live by, and it's not a story that really has like this life lesson in there so much. But I think it's one that's worth telling because it has a lot of things that you can relate to, and a lot of people. It does not matter where you live, when you live. There's a lot of the pieces of the story that come back to you. What I think it is, though, is most of all, it's a story about the people that lived here. It's a story about the village that developed here, and about the paths and the choices that they decided to make, and maybe not knowing quite where it was going to take them, where it was going to lead. Choices in the name of progress, in the name of providing for your family, and just settling in, you know, in the career you're going to have. But what I think is interesting is that here at Brandywine, something began. It was the start of a revolution that would not only change the way that the people lived right in this area, not only change that for northeastern Ohio, but actually in some ways was the beginning of a revolution that affected the entire nation. And what's interesting is the people that decided to take part in this, they may not have seen that this very revolution and the things that were going to happen were going to lead to the very life's blood of their village being drawn out, and the village turning into, well, what you see before you today. So what I'd like to do is kind of discover a little bit of what that path was they decided to go down, what the landscape can tell us a little bit around here, but most of all, if we're going to talk about, like, you know, what path to head down, the journeys that we lead, what better place to start than right over here at the end of an old roadway that goes through the trees. So if you're up for it, I'd like to step on over. This right here is Old Stanford Road. Now, this road is built in 1813, and it is quite an improvement for the area. We get an idea. I like the story that one of the guys that rides here early and writes his journal on this area of Ohio. His name's John Mellish. He travels through here on an inspection trip. I think he's coming out to see what's going on, whether he wants to move here, that kind of what opportunities are here. He rides a section of roadway down through Boston, which is right at the end of this, and he reports that it is the worst stretch of road that he's seen yet in Ohio. Or not in Ohio, I'm sorry, in the entire country. Which is really saying something because the guy came from New England. So he hit a pretty good stretch coming over, but he talks about riding his horse down through there and it being so bad that his horse was actually sinking up to its knees in the mud. And it's interesting though, that's 1811 that he's coming through. At that time, I think a lot of what they're calling roadways we might refer to as trails. Initially getting from one point to another, if you want to get a horse through, you cut down a couple of trees maybe. Eventually, if you want to get your wagon through with a couple of oxen, well, you cut down a few more trees. You get a wider path, but you're still left with this muddy, stump-covered pathway leading from place to place. And the establishment of roads like this, which of course it would have looked a little bit different, but established roads, they improved not only travel, but they did another thing. If you go about a mile and a half down here, you're in the town of Boston. If you head about 2 miles in the other direction, you're in the town of Northfield. So you get a roadway that connects communities, connects them for business, for trade. It does something else for this particular area around Brandywine. It is not really an accident that it heads right through here. There's particular features and things which I'm sure you can guess what I'm talking about. But there's things here that make this a very valuable spot. The roadway that goes through is important because it's the first step in that revolution. It's the first step in bringing people to this area right here. And so I'm sure you know where we're headed to next. Let's take a look at what makes this spot so valuable. Does anybody have any questions? No? In that case, let's take a slow stroll because it's a really nice view over there. But head over on the walkway over here and do a little bit more. why would anyone want to live here, right?
Water power.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, settling the area at the time. There was a gentleman around here that knew that. One of the first people to move into this area, his name was George Wallace. He actually works as a land, or he works on commission to sell land around this spot for the Lake Erie Land Company. He sees the value of this place. He sees the value of the water power here, and he saved this chunk from clear around Brandywine Inn all the way around the top of the waterfall for himself. Sells off a few of the other smaller parcels right over here. What he does is very early on decides to take advantage of that water power and what it provides. On the far side of the falls, 1814, he builds a sawmill here. And sawmill would have been good business at the time. If you think about it, the first folks that come in and settle in the area, they're moving into a very dense forest. First thing you do is cut down the trees, right? By the way, I love that little anecdote. I don't know if you've ever heard it. But they say that Ohio was so forested at the time when folks first moved in here. Do you hear this?
Yeah, the squirrel.
The squirrel can climb in the tree at Lake Erie and can go all the way to the Ohio River without touching the ground. Puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
But okay, so if you've got a sawmill here, as folks clear their land, they're able to haul that lumber over. You can get it processed. You can do a couple of things. You can build your house. You can build your cabin with it. You also sell it off. So good business with the sawmill. A year later, he and his brother-in-law built on this side a grist mill. And if you haven't seen a picture of it, take a look at this.
Now, we noticed that there was some older foundation with some more modern cinder block over top of the foundation. Is that, I mean, this looks like, is that?
So the older foundation you're seeing is the foundation for this mill.
Yeah.
There's a much more recent mill that's built right over top of it that actually, I've got another picture of right here, which is this one.
Okay, and that's the cinder block over top of the original. Gotcha. Okay.
And to avoid repeating myself, I'm going to talk about that one in a minute.
Good. Yeah, exactly.
So build this mill in 1815. Now this one's a grist mill. You've got agriculture that's starting to become big business in the area. Having a local grist mill is very important for folks in this spot. If you think about how rough those roadways were, well, you don't want to haul all that material any further than you have to. Come to your local grist mill, get it processed. Something else happens though. You've got time to sort of hang around. You've got time to spend while things are being processed. So you start to get trade that happens around these spots. Start to get bartering. It also leads to other businesses that, like George Wallace and his family, start up here as well, which is like their general store, selling some other goods. So all of a sudden, this starts to be a hub for social life, for people to come into. This is a place you go if you need to find things or get things done. The following year, worth mentioning also, is the third industry he starts up, which is right up the creek here, which is a distillery. Now, of course, you got a distillery, right? It makes you chuckle a little bit, but it's curious, and it comes down to the whole way that the thing works, because they produce some fine-grade whiskey up there, and it gets a reputation for how good it is. You come here to get things processed, you bring an extra bushel of grain, you go up there, you can trade a bushel of grain for a gallon of whiskey. Now, the thing is that banks and the currency in the area, not real strong at the time, a little sketchy on whose currency you're going to back, but that whiskey's so good that it becomes currency. It gets the name Brandywine currency is what it gets referred to, and that's something that gets traded and bartered a lot. So it does become big business. Nothing to know of, but you can certainly find, some stuff. What happens though is that all these mills come together, and think about it. 1813 for the roadway to come through. 1814 the sawmill, 1815 the grist mill, 1816 that. All of a sudden things start to prosper. Things start to come together, and by 1820 this is a full-fledged village. We've got families that are living here. They actually open up another piece of a mill in 1820, which you don't get to see in a lot of pictures, and it's kind of like this one. So take a look at that. Yeah, you can see the grist mill. You can see pieces of the old check dam that went across the top of the falls, and actually I got a real close-up picture of it right here. So the scars you see on the top of the falls are from this.
is from right there.
So this front beam that runs across raises that water. I think it was something like 7 or 8 inches.
And that's the etching. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's that rectangular cup.
Yeah.
So you push water off one way to the sawmill, one way to the grist mill. Down in the base of this, actually you can see like the doorway that's open. There's a 12-foot water wheel there. Water that pours off hits that and does an undershot. It goes underneath, and so there's your power for your mill. The woolen mill is powered by the same mechanism that turns that.
So they run belt suction or something? Or?
You know, I don't know exactly how the inside of that looks. I've seen diagrams of other mills that would, it was more of like in the early days like a gear process. But yeah, they belted them out not too long after that. You get the things like a Lowell and those different places. But a little bit of a more modern mill then. These were big, geared up, squeaky, noisy, thumped in a certain way. You knew the thing was working right if you knew the thump, the rhythmic thing was going. Yeah. So. But that woolen mill, that's one of the things that gets added in 1820. By that time, they have a school, they have a post office. You have a post office, you're officially a village, right? Yeah. So
and a McDonald's and a Walmart.
They came along a little bit later. Bigger foundation.
They still had a bridge over there.
Yeah. Old wooden bridge originally, and then I don't know if it's metal, but it looks. I can't tell either. Not sure exactly. That I think that has a metal frame to it, and that's a little bit of a more recent. Picture. This one, as far as I can piece together, I don't have a date on it, but with the piece of this busted off and the blowout on the foundation down here, I'm going to guess it's after the flood in 1913. Okay. Now the more modern, that Champion Electric Company mill that goes in 1920, so it's got to be somewhere in that window. So 1913 to 1920.
I was going to ask you if they ever worried about, you had the big wheel and that big dam that guide the water, whether or not a flood would be detrimental to this equipment, so that kind of answers my question.
And something happens. Okay, not too long after this place turns into that town and you've got all the people coming in and you've got this production going on, let me give you one more piece of the story before we get into that.
Sure.
So life is good and people are prospering, but it's not that good. You've got a lot of people that are growing, you've got a lot of people that are processing flour. It means that you don't have very many people to sell it to. Now, if you were to take a barrel of flour and you were to get it to New York, you could sell it for $8. Pretty good prices. Around here, you're lucky to get half of that. So getting it there is the goal. Now, you can load it on a wagon, but to get a ton of flour from here over to New York costs you $25 to ship it overland. And then you've got all the worries about losing it and the hardship, all the things that come into overland travel. So you need a better form of transportation, which shows up in 1827. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about already. Yeah, now in 1827, you travel down Stanford Road. No longer you're going to the town of Boston, but you're going to Lock 32 on the Ohio and Erie Canal. Put in the canal, it connects everything from Akron to Cleveland. You bring your goods down, load them on a boat. The boat can travel to Cleveland, to Lake Erie, across Lake Erie, over to the Erie Canal, all the way through the state of New York, over to Albany, down the Hudson River, and into New York. You've got your way to get your flour there. What costs you $25 to ship from here overland costs you $3 to ship via the canals and get over there. Life is good. Things are moving, things are prospering. All of a sudden, this is not a sleepy little community. This is a hustling, bustling production center. This is about the time where this is rivaling Cleveland for the amount of production. But the influence of that canal in the first 15 years becomes obvious when you take a look at a couple things. One is that in 1843, the flood comes through. You get 11 square miles of land that drains through this spot. You get enough water dumped on it, and we're in a river valley. You're going to get flooded. The flood that comes through damages each one of these mills in 1843, even the woolen mill up on the hill. Now, what happens afterwards is what's telling. The sawmill is rebuilt. It operates for another 10 years. The grist mill is rebuilt. It operates for quite a long time. But that woolen mill, they don't rebuild. And the reason is even in that short time, in the 15 years since the canal opened, the stuff that's coming in off that canal is already out-competing what they can produce right here in their own backyard in that woolen mill. So whereas in the days before, when the canal first popped up in the 1830s, that mill employs 20 people at its height. The grist mill is worth 10 times in 1850 what it's built for originally. So you see that prospering, but you already see something else that's coming in with the canal, and that's the competition that it invites. And it's interesting. Canals float boats on water. Where you have water going up and down over hills, you've got locks, you've got check dams, you've got spillways. Now, all of those are spots where you're funneling water and you've got water moving through that has power because it's moving up and down. Where you have water power, what can you build? More mills. So, down there along the canal itself, you start to see industry pop up, start to see mills built now right on the shipping lane, which is something that this place has trouble obviously competing with. Where you had Stamford Road bringing people to this spot at one time, now Stamford Road is leading down to Boston and is taking that business down to the canal. So it's now leading people out of this area. The canal introduces something else as well, which I can take that too, so it's standard. The canal introduces new commodities, like this one. Yep. It's some good coal out of Ohio. And with coal, you get a couple of different things. It's not necessarily the coal itself that is the big game changer in all of this, but it's what coal allows you to harness. And that's another form of water power, which in this case would be steam, right? Now, if you've got steam power, you can build mills. You can build a different kind of mill, though. Whereas here, with the water power over the falls, you're limited to whatever your flow is. You can affect that a little bit. But the mills are largely small structures, only employing a handful of people, and they're very local. This milling industry, this is the first step right here around this waterfall, and that's built all over northeast Ohio. When it takes this step, though, these are huge mills with a great amount of power. Massive metal machinery, different kinds of rollers. This takes a little bit of capital in order to be able to build. And they're so large and they can produce so much that you need a pretty large workforce in order to run the thing. And also, where are you going to build it? Is you going to build them out here on the hill slopes and everything? No, you're going to build them near that shipping lane down there. But you're going to build them also where there's a population that's able to work them. So you employ hundreds of people in a large steel factory, in a coal-powered factory like that. What we see happen is that all across the hillsides where you have these small operations going on, it's starting to be sucked and pulled down to the canals. It's starting to be pulled out into these urban centers that are starting to build. And you see the evidence of that real quick. In 1830, Cleveland's population is about 1,000 people. And the production coming out of here is rivaling it. 20 years later, after the canal's been in operation and everything, the population of Cleveland has jumped up to 17,000 people. Which means it's doubled 4 times in the span of 20 years. You get a big urban center coming in. You get new forms of transportation as well. If you've got steam and you've got the power of coal, well, you can then produce steel. You can produce new forms of getting around and shipping, including one that I have a picture of I really like. Which is this one. Take a close look at that, and it's an old picture, it's a little fuzzy. And it's also reflected in the water, so it can be kind of hard to see. But can you tell what they're shipping on the canal boat? It's kind of hard. It is lumber, but it's a particular kind of lumber.
Railroad ties?
They're shipping in railroad ties on the canal. And I think it's interesting because it's a great picture where you see one form of transportation ushering in the very thing that's going to put it out of business.
Yeah.
Right? So when the railroads come through, you get that push as well. Now the canals and the railroads, they're not leading to the spot; they're simply passing it by. So Brandywine starts to feel the effects of that. And another thing that's telling with the railroad is that when they put a stop down there in Boston as the railroad comes through, they don't call it simply Boston, but they actually name it Boston Mills to stop because of the amount of milling and industry that's going on down there. The effects of this in the early years, well, I like this. By the end of the 19th century, just in Akron, and these are just the same kind of production mills or similar mills to what we have here. You've got and these are also what you would think of as giant, like manufacturing mills with the big steam stacks and everything else, employing hundreds of people. You've got the Cyberling Mill down there. You've got the Akron Milling Company, Great Western Cereal Company, and the Schumacher Mills. Which, if you're from around here and you know Akron, those last two, Schumacher and Great Western Cereal, they end up being bought and combined, and they become what we know today as Quaker Oats. Yeah. Now that's just in Akron, and that's just related to this. You also have then Cleveland and Akron together that are vying for actually the largest industrial spot in the entire nation at the time. You get the different companies like Goodyear and Firestone in the early 20th century. You get the numerous steel and iron producing plants. They're making everything around here from clay piping, like sewer piping, to marbles as a major industry. And it's really, you're starting to see the change from this lifestyle to a new form, an urbanization and growth. But this isn't the end of Brandywine. This is not the end of milling in the area. For that, what I want to do is take one quick walk, one more stop right over here, and take a look at it itself. Any questions about anything before we leave? Okay.
Up along the lake in the Cleveland area, you know, he talked about industries that, you know, milling and whatnot. I know that with the introduction of the steam, steam engine and whatnot, but prior to that, was Cleveland basically centered around some of the big shipyards, or, you know, and how far back does the steel industry go in Cleveland? Do you have any idea? I'm not very sure.
Let's see. So, let's see if I can put it together.
Yeah.
Okay. The Cleveland does not become that big port until they dredge it out when they put the canal through. But prior to that, the big shipping port up along Lake Erie is Sandusky. And originally, when they come through and they look for the places where they're going to run the canals out of here. I may be starting a little further back than what you're interested in. Where they're going to run the canals through the state, they already know that they want two canals. Sandusky becomes the first spot they look at, because if you look at a map of Ohio, you got Sandusky and almost a straight line down to Columbus, through Chillicothe, and down to Portsmouth on the river.
Okay.
The problem is that they look at it and say, well, the terrain, the water supply and everything needed for this, they figure that the Black River over there cannot support the requirements for the canal. They're not able to build enough reservoirs and do it. Akron, meanwhile, has got those wonderful portage lakes that run right along the top, and it's the Continental Divide, so it's the highest spot around. You've got the Cuyahoga River that leads all the way up to Cleveland, which has potential as a port, but isn't until they finally decide that this is the way they're going to go with it. They dredge out the port itself, then you start to see things boom.
Okay.
So you have a shipping industry that's in place prior to Cleveland becoming the big port.
Okay.
And as far as how much the building actually takes place there, boy, I don't have a good reference for that. But I do know that what happens is when shipping really begins to boom up there on the lake in the later 19th century, that's when they identify those iron ore deposits that are up around Lake Superior. They also build the canalways that allow you to connect your way down to Cleveland. So it's a wonderful marriage between harvesting the ore that's coming from around Lake Superior and the coal that's coming from down around Youngstown. So it's that marriage that happens right there around the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the family, or was it like empty for a long time and then restored, or?
It is, let's see. My history gets fuzzy around the mid-20th century on the end. And actually, I refer you to the folks that run and operate that now. I'm sure they'd be happy. They're very nice folks. They'd be happy to chat with you about it. But I know that it's built in the 1840s. Does that give an exact date? 1848, okay. And it's James Wallace that built it. James Wallace is the son of George Wallace. Matter of fact, his oldest son is...
Wallace brothers, yeah.
Okay.
And then he did, and then his son James built it.
Yeah.
And then it says it was restored.
He lives in that building and operates the grist mill and stays here until 1874. In 1874, he finally sells it to a family called the Miles family, and the Miles family operate the grist mill, and as far as I know, live in the house until 1910 when it finally shuts its doors, and then that's where my history gets a little fuzzy. It's after 1910. Yeah.
But it's still basically the original place.
Yeah. What's going on is we're starting to see that life and the very thing that keeps this place a living, breathing community start to be pulled out. And Brandywine is now becoming a little more of that sleepy little village on the hill. The mill is still operating for some time, and it's not like this doesn't happen like you're flipping a switch and everybody just up and floods out of here or whatever. I think one of the things that's really powerful in that probably unfortunately a lot of people can relate to in the story is that if you've ever been part of a company that has had to downsize, if you've ever been part of a company that's gone under, or you've ever had to pack up and move and look for work or whatever, I think you can sympathize or empathize a little bit with what happened in the village. It's not a decision you come to easily. It's a change in everything you know about your way of life. And so it is something that you hold on to and you release reluctantly, and you begin to fade out. And that's what happens here. Throughout the late 19th century, slowly things start to head out. Like I said, the mill keeps operating until 1910, when finally I think it just can't compete anymore, and there's not that connection to the place that somebody wants to keep it open and operating for what it is. So in 1910, it shuts its door, and then the big final step in the whole thing comes in 1913, where in Easter weekend 1913, it begins to rain around here. You know this story already? Yeah. Are you familiar with the flood that came through?
I know there was one, but I don't know.
So the story goes that in the winter, it was a heavy snow winter, and it's a very wet spring up to this point. So the ground's completely saturated. Easter Sunday, it begins to rain, and it rains for 3 days straight, and it drops 10 inches of rain in the spot, which may not seem overwhelming, but when there's nowhere for it to go, except for to flood into places like this, and to, the Cuyahoga, the entire watershed through here, it drains 800 square miles of land. That's pretty significant when it all rushes in 3 days like that. And it's called the Flood of 1913. As far as I know, I think it is still the largest natural disaster in Ohio's history. It affects everything from up here, down through Columbus, and down into Dayton, and especially having a big effect down in Dayton. And I used to work down there, and you'd see the big spillways they put in as a result of it. What happens up here is it knocks the edge of that dam off. It obviously blows out the edge of this mill. It's in the valley, destroys for the most part the canal and the railway down there. We have pictures where the railway ties are actually bent like a corkscrew and wound in spots. I don't even know how much power that takes. Buildings knocked off their foundations and everything else. Whole towns are almost washed away. It's a very significant flood. After this, when it comes time to rebuild, what are you going to invest in? Well, for the most part, it was the end of the canal. The railroad, though, gets reinvested in, and things go on and they continue. This is still not the end of Brandywine's production, though. We're standing in the base of it, and it's that picture we showed earlier. In 1920, a gentleman named Hale comes in here, and he builds the Champion Electric Company. Now, what they produce out of here is the electric skillets, electric cookingware. They produce an electric hot dog cooker that's, I think, was their biggest seller. It's called the Wiener Steamer. And the production, though, is not for like home use so much as it is for like restaurants, large kitchens, hotels. What happens at 1920? It's built. 1921, it gets struck by lightning, burns down. He perseveres, though. He rebuilds the thing, and they go on and they work for another 16 years in the area until then a second time it's struck by lightning and burns down. And at this point, he doesn't rebuild it. Yeah. So if you're hearing the clouds come over, head for the road. But it's funny. That second lightning bolt, then, effectively is the end of production and industry here at Brandywine. It's the end of the village itself and the actual production that comes out of it. And so what remains now is we have that Brandywine Inn, James Wallace's old house. We have the foundations like the one that we're in, and some of the old foundations for the homes that are still up around here in the landscape. And we're left with this waterfall that still shows the scars of the industry that took place here over the years. And I think the story is good for illustrating what I was talking about, that it is one of those stories of making the decisions and heading down particular paths, seeking out things, in some cases maybe in the name of progress or in providing, and going down certain roads, but not knowing where they would lead. I would venture to say that the folks that headed out of New England and settled in this area probably didn't think that they were going to settle around these waterfalls and these little streams up on the hill slopes through here. And they maybe didn't see, especially the folks like right here at Brandywine, that the industry that they were starting was going to lead to such an impact into something that was going to go on to be the revolution that would change our country in a lot of ways. And I would bet that they did not see coming the fact that the very thing that they were helping to produce and to build on was the thing that was going to eventually lead to this village fading away and leaving out. But I think it's important to remember that it's not so much a sad story. It's not a story of people that were here and they withered and died away, but it's just simply a story of change. The choices we make, they have small changes. Sometimes these add up to big changes, and what happens is life goes on. We continue to have water that flows over our waterfall, and with this comes this continuing value for the place and a continuing power. And I also think it's one of the great pieces of irony around here, and that's that now Brandywine Falls itself is the place that people come to escape large industrial urbanized centers. And I think that if you take 5 minutes to walk over here, head down to the platform, or walk right over the edge and just stop, listen, appreciate, and enjoy it, it will do more for your understanding of why that is than a whole hour of me standing here and talking and keeping going on. But I will leave you with one last thought before you head out, and that is this: that the power of Brandywine Falls, it's always been here. The only thing that has really changed is the way that we value that power. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming along and listening.
That was great.
I hope you have a good visit, and if you want to see any more pictures, I'd be happy to. But thank you. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Glad we